Well, hey there! Welcome to Eorzea, the land of plenty, the land of adventure, the land of cat girls, and cat guys if you fancy. Here you can start your world-spanning adventure and interact with a dedicated community of like-minded players. Chase fame and glory by joining an adventurer's guild, pledging yourself in service of an army, and working with a covert group of other helpful and powerful protectors of the realm. But don't get too complacent, because complacency is the enemy of excellence. Join a free company, take on a profession, learn to play the economy, get a girlfriend, buy a house, and get married. Have a kid? Try some killing, raid a raid, dungeon some dungeons, go out into the world and destroy a god. There's nothing you can't do in Eorzea. Hey you kid! Yeah? What's your favorite thing to do in Eorzea?
Drink the blood of my enemies and sell their limbs on the worldwide marketplace.
Anything is possible in Eorzea, so what are you waiting for? Come on down and join today. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a casual review, a series where I test and review popular games so you can decide if you want to try them out. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at Final Fantasy XIV and how the game presents itself to new players. Now, I know this game is absolutely enormous, and in no way do I think I can review the entire game in one video, but our journey into the unknown will start with one step. This video specifically will cover some of the base features of the game, like creating a character, what questing is like, and how the profession system works. Before we get into the review, I'd like to thank you for watching. Leave a like on the video and subscribe for more content. I appreciate your support. Now let's get into the review of the #1 MMORPG in the market today, Final Fantasy XIV. Most people already know, but I think it's important to acknowledge the history of Final Fantasy XIV development, because it shows the developers' player-first philosophy for creating and working on continuous improvements. I'll try and keep this exceptionally short. Final Fantasy XIV originally launched in 2010, but was so poorly received by gamers that Square Enix decided to shut down the game and focus on rebuilding it for a second launch 2 years later. This decision came with a new game director, Naoki Yoshida, who led the Final Fantasy XIV dev team to a much better relaunch in 2012. Yoshida and the dev team apologized to the player base and actually embedded the shutdown of the original game into the lore of Final Fantasy XIV, hence the name A Realm Reborn. Players were much happier with the game and with the dev team, and from then on, the game saw a slow and steady growth. With a strong and dedicated community at its core and expansions that were received fairly well, the game rose to become one of the top MMORPGs in the market today. But it wasn't until World of Warcraft shot itself in the foot too many times that Final Fantasy XIV took the #1 spot in terms of most active players. After the disappointing Battle for Azeroth and Shadowlands expansions failed to capture the attentions of players for very long, many WoW players were left without a home. Final Fantasy XIV had a lot of similarities in game design as well, but it seemed to capture something that WoW at the time could not: a community. So not only was it something new and something relatively comfortable, but it also had a thriving community that had a good relationship with its developers. The important thing to understand is that Naoki Yoshida and the Final Fantasy XIV dev team are completely idolized by the community, and because the development of the game has mostly catered to different parts of the community, the game has a thriving and very dedicated player base. The Final Fantasy XIV dev team have put so much thought into what the community would like that the amount of content in the game now is almost dizzying, but that's a great problem to have. Final Fantasy XIV players like role-playing? The dev team created an entire marriage system and the ability to buy player housing that you can pimp out beyond your wildest dreams. Final Fantasy XIV players like challenging and satisfying endgame content. The dev team added raids with multiple difficulty levels that properly reward you for your time and skill. Final Fantasy XIV players want to fucking gamble? The dev team put in an entire casino. Most of the time I would say that you don't need to have 1 million players playing your game to truly enjoy it. Play what you want as long as it makes you happy, and don't worry if it's popular or not. But I have to say, and this might sound kind of sappy, but it was genuinely exciting to walk into a city and see so many people just hanging out together, enjoying themselves. I don't even know what they were doing there, but it's just awesome to see people socializing. And it's not just cities that feel more populated. There are people running around completing quests, flying on their weird mounts, or just generally making the world feel like it's alive. This is something I've become so used to only seeing whenever an expansion or a new game launches and everyone is hyped to be figuring things out together. But Final Fantasy XIV has been out for ages, and the last expansion, Endwalker, came out about 5 months ago, which is still pretty fresh, but long enough ago that it's genuinely impressive that I'm still experiencing a small queue every single time I try to log in. This feeling of community, even one that I'm not particularly included in yet, makes the rest of the game feel 10 times better. It makes me feel welcomed, even though I'm not the most social person. If I need help, there are people there to help me. If I want to try my hand at role-playing or joining a guild, the option is there. This is how an MMORPG is supposed to feel, and it's just something I personally haven't seen since the first 2 weeks of New World maybe, and then maybe the launch of Classic WoW. Like I said, it's not everything, but it is a big part of what I think the MMO experience should be. Alright, let's get into the game. First thing we'll talk about, and probably the most important part of Final Fantasy XIV, is character creation. Creating a character is something you may only need to do once in your entire Final Fantasy XIV career, so it's crucial that you like the character you create. Creating a character is detailed, the first step being to choose a race. The types of races are slightly different takes on the normal fantasy tropes. You got the generic brand humans called the Hyur, you got the generic elves called the Elezen, the generic orcs called the Rogadin, the dragon kind of Au Ra, the cat girls of Mikote, the bunny girls of Viera, and the beast race called the Hrothgar. And if you're thinking, wait, didn't he miss one? No, I don't think so. Classes are pretty cool, normal enough that players would understand exactly what tropes they fill in a fantasy game, but different enough to fit the world of Final Fantasy. I chose the Gladiator because on top of trying a new MMO that I know very little about, I also wanted to make it harder on myself and try to be a tank. There are also plenty of customizations you can make to your character's appearance, but don't stress too much about these because later on you unlock a way to change all the cosmetic details of your character. And here's something different about Final Fantasy XIV that I personally haven't seen before. You can choose a religion. Final Fantasy XIV gives you a couple choices at character creation that are purely for the roleplay. If you want to spend the time to decide these details, you can, but they have no effect on player power or stats. They are purely there for your enjoyment. After creating a character, you get put right into the game and start your journey. All the early quests are basically tutorials around the city that are accompanied with fun little stories. Then when you've completed a number of tasks around the city, they send you off into the world to do more serious adventuring stuff. This plays very much into the narrative-driven leveling experience, which Final Fantasy XIV does not shy away from. It's very much telling you straight up that you are going to be really experiencing the story, instead of the story playing out alongside you while you focus on killing things in large quantities. You have two main focuses with your questing experience. You have your MSQ, or main scenario quest, and your class quests, which are unlocked while leveling. You also have a bunch of side quests that you pick up from different people around the towns and cities, but the MSQs are really what's important and are what pushes your character's progression further towards the endgame. So the narrative and character structure is done extremely well, but I will say that after a few quests of, go here, talk to this dude, okay now go here, talk to this guy, okay now go here, talk to this lady, it starts to get a bit old. The community tells you that it's best if you stick with it and read through all of the text because the story is the focus, and that does make complete sense. But all this back and forth and long form dialogue really has my skip text finger twitching. I will say that the quests that ask you to kill X number of monsters feel about as good as they would ever feel. I don't know this for certain, but there doesn't seem to be a drop chance to these quests. If you need 4 vials of monster blood, you only have to kill 4 of that monster to get the blood. None of this kill 30 monsters, but only 4 of them actually have blood in their veins. Even though kill X quests still aren't exactly the most interesting, I feel like the game made it as friendly as possible, so you don't have to spend 30 minutes on one kill quest. That means you can actually focus on the storytelling and the lore of the world more, since you aren't spending all your time inventing the most efficient ways to cause monster genocide. And that's probably for the best, because early game combat is slow. The combat of course is on a global cooldown system, and the GCD is pretty high compared to other games. This may just be because I come from World of Warcraft, where the GCD is fairly low, but it does make the combat feel a bit more like a waiting game. That feeling is made a bit worse because I'm still at a low level, and the game doesn't give you many skills up front. For example, as a level 15 tank, I had 2 interrupts, 2 damage skills, 1 AoE skill, a taunt, and a toggle to make sure I was generating enmity, or for the laypeople, threat. This made questing combat pretty slow, because I was basically just switching between my 2 damage skills. Now one thing I did like was that the 2 damage skills were combos. If you use them in the correct order, they would be more effective. I like that. It's like a mix of tab targeting and action combat that makes fighting feel a bit more interactive. Still pretty slow at low levels though, since I really only had 1 combo to use. The combat visuals are what make it more exciting. These are simple sword fighting skills that my guy is using, but the game goes completely overboard with the animations and graphical effects to make it seem like I'm stabbing my enemies with the power of a million suns. One more thing I like about Final Fantasy XIV's combat is that the enemies' special attacks are telegraphed. There are bright orange zones on the floor to tell you exactly where the damage box is for the attack. If you are in the zone when the attack starts, you are damaged even if the attack animation is long and the enemy looks like they missed you. That's a great way to teach a new player how to avoid mechanics without it feeling super punishing. They don't have to rely on watching the enemy and the nuances of the enemy's attack animations, they just have to worry about orange zones on the floor and how much time they have to get out of that zone. And how do you know how much time you have to get out of the zone? There's a cast bar above the enemy's name. Easy to learn, easy to track. Combat is overall a good experience and it picks up when you get to higher levels, but early on it was really hard to keep myself engaged with it for long periods of time. Maybe being a tank has something to do with it, but going into my first dungeon, the combat was a little tedious simply because I was really only spamming 2 or 3 buttons. Now I was told this was because the number of skills have been reduced over time to account for the expansions and the new or updated skills they brought to the game. I can respect this decision because I see how the game has generally spread its progression over a lot of content, but it does mean that the first 30 levels or so are pretty monotonous. I'm told it gets much better in later levels, but that's a lot of content to get through before a new player would be able to enjoy combat. Not a game breaker, but combat definitely isn't the forte of the early game. Final Fantasy XIV does have the standard class trinity of tank, DPS, and healer. There's dungeon content that you can join, as well as trials, which are basically single boss battles, and raids, which are longer, more intense dungeons. I'll talk about those more later on, but the one thing I do want to mention is that if you need a refresher or are new to the role, Final Fantasy XIV has an entirely separate training system specific to group content. I'm a tank, and it scares me to have all that pressure riding on my shoulders, so I did all the tank lessons before I even thought of joining a dungeon group. Overall, Final Fantasy XIV combat is pretty okay. It seems standard and I can see how it would feel good at later levels. I think it's just hard to feel how cool it will be when you're still at low level and repeating 2 skills in the same order. The gear chest is a blessing of game design. Who knew something so simple could be so impactful? So at this point I just believe it's infinite, even though I don't know that for sure. Because of this, bag space was never an issue. Your other items are held in your inventory, which has 140 slots available, and I really haven't even filled up one tab. I love not having to worry about inventory space. I know it's part of the feeling of immersion in a lot of RPGs, but it's just one of those things in MMOs that was cool and made sense back in the day, but in 2022 I personally feel like it's just a nuisance. I don't feel like it's world breaking to not have to worry about bag space or weight limits or survival mechanics like thirst and hunger. There's definitely a place for that kind of stuff in gaming. I would just rather not be in MMORPGs. You have so many other complex systems to worry about, it just doesn't seem like we should be worrying about these things specifically unless it's a major mechanic in the game. Anyway, back to the gear chest. You can click on this button right here, which gives you the option to automatically equip the recommended gear for your class. I used this every single time I got gear. It just didn't make sense for me not to. I don't understand stats enough yet to gear myself up, and I'm so low level anyway that I'm sure it wouldn't really make a difference if I were to know. You can also save gear sets by clicking this button, so whenever you want to switch to another class, you can easily switch between gear sets as long as the gear is still in your gear chest. Speaking of switching classes, one character can be any class. All you have to do is change your main hand weapon and join the guild for that class. On your character sheet, there's an entire tab dedicated to showing you what level you are with each class or profession that's available in the game. You can literally do everything. Starting another class on the same character is just like creating an alt, but you get the added benefit of being able to switch between classes at any time. Seriously, you can just change your main hand weapon and put on some new gear and you are immediately at full power with another class. You still have to level it up of course, but being able to switch on the fly like that is so much better than having to start an entirely new character. The only issue I found with this was that when you switch classes, you can't redo quests. So to level up the new class, at least at low levels, you'll have to do fates and levaments, which are basically just repeatable world quests, and it can get pretty tedious. Once you get to a certain level though, you can spam dungeons and level up pretty quick. I think there's also a catch-up system, so the second class you play is easier to level, but I don't know enough about this yet to fully comment on it. Very early on, I was given a quest to go check out the Goblet, a residential district where you can purchase land plots and have a public house. My lord, do some people put a crazy amount of hours into this system. The level of detail you can achieve with your house is insane, down to placing hundreds of tiny knickknacks around the home. I don't know exactly how the decorating system works, but some of this placement, especially of the small things, seems almost too precise to be a pre-made bundled decoration. And anyone can come in at any time if you set your house to public. Your guests can leave comments on your home and you can publish those comments in your guest book if you want to show it off. Look, I don't usually go into MMOs looking for stuff like this. Like, I know I would absolutely suck at decorating a home. I don't even know how to keep my desk organized. But this player housing feature is just awesome to look at and experience. This feature isn't for me, and I fully recognize that it's not. But man, does it make me happy to see people putting so much time into this and really enjoying themselves. This has nothing to do with the core progression in the game, at least not that I'm aware of. It's simply just here to enjoy if you want to. I think after seeing player housing in Final Fantasy XIV, I finally understand why so many people want it in other games too. Okay, now let's talk about the main focus of Final Fantasy XIV, the story. I like how you're starting off as a nobody. At the very beginning of the game, you join a guild to be an adventurer, and the quests you complete are just classified as good deeds. And a lot of the side quests around the low-level areas follow that narrative as well. At one point, I was just picking trash out of some nets for a fisherman's wife, and then cleaning the docks for some random sailor because he was just too tired to do it himself. That's it. No quest to go kill someone or something, no quest to go collect this rare or necessary item, just a small filler quest that makes the world seem like it's actually alive. The people around you are just going about their day while you're doing your own thing. A lot of MMOs do this, but it just feels like Final Fantasy XIV is going out of its way to make sure that this world is not all war and death. It has normal people in it too. Even on the MSQ, one of the first big things I did was uncover a ranking officer's plot to sell some valuable resources to some bandits. It's not a grandiose adventure or even a very intense quest. It's basically just building up your resume of good deeds so you feel like you're actually growing as an adventurer. Another thing I like about how Final Fantasy XIV tells the story is how they separate the class story from the main story. Every class has its own adventure they go on within their class guild, and it has no crossover with the main story. This means you can engage with any of these class stories at any point in the MSQ, and it won't be out of place. It also means that you have a new story to experience with each new class, which is a huge amount of content. The class quests are unlocked at different levels and will progress the story along with your strength. Completing the quest unlocks more powerful skills for your class or some class-specific gear. This makes leveling feel a bit more satisfying, knowing that you're working towards multiple goals: class levels, power and skills, and the class story. The storytelling itself is brilliant. Final Fantasy XIV tells its story through the use of many single-player RPG storytelling mechanics. Most MSQs will have some sort of cutscene where you are directly involved with what's going on. Your character talks but doesn't have a voice, so you are able to feel a bit more like the NPCs you're interacting with are talking directly to you. You can put yourself in the shoes of your character. The world itself is pretty damn beautiful, and I think the best way to explain it is like this. I notice that when I play MMOs, a lot of the time I have my camera focused down a bit. I like facing the camera a bit down because it helps me to see the area directly around my character. In my mind, this helps me to be more aware of my surroundings. I can see if enemies are aggroed, if there are PvP flagged players around, if there's anything in my immediate area that I can collect like a resource for a profession or something. Final Fantasy XIV is the only game where I started to spend a lot of time with my camera tilted up. Not always, but whenever I was walking around in the open areas, I would tilt my camera up and run to my next destination with the sky in view. I could take in everything that the environment was offering me. I mean, another factor of this is because I really didn't have anything to fear when walking to and from destinations, but it's still crazy the game got me to start breaking that habit at all. On the flip side, I think the world can be a bit of what turns some people away. It's really a preference thing. The world is extremely fleshed out and pretty complicated, with lots of world building and character development going on. It can be pretty hard to keep track of what everything means and who people are. And yes, the world's graphical and character animation style is a part of this. I know that the stereotype with Final Fantasy XIV is that it's a weeb game, and I can't necessarily deny that the influences of Japanese anime can be found in a Japanese-based game. I like anime, so I personally don't mind it. But for those of you who don't like anime, what I will say is that once you start playing the game and realizing that the world and its characters and the story could be done just as well with any other style of animation, the game really opens up. Yes, there are cat girls and bunny girls and whatever the Lalafell are, but the game has so much more to it that even if you're strongly against it, you can get to badass raids and enjoy a captivating story without ever having to talk to a creepy, overweight potato. I won't spoil the story itself, but the first 20-ish levels are spent running quests in whatever starting zone you were in, so depending on which major city you started your journey, you will have a different beginning to your story. Then after you finish the 20-level introduction to the game, you merge with the main story and everyone is on the same MSQ. You meet the leaders of the 3 main factions and the Scions of the 7th Dawn, and head out on your world-saving adventure. Part of this adventure, of course, are dungeons, raids, and trials. So far I've only done dungeons and trials, so I'll leave raids for the second part of the review. The dungeons and trials are all extremely cinematic, and while the level design of the dungeons isn't the best, experiencing every dungeon once is a must. The music and visuals of the dungeons are high quality, and there's an important story behind each one. On a gameplay level, you're able to queue at the entrance to the dungeon, or by using the duty finder. For dungeons at least, you can actually queue with NPCs who will fill out your party and run the dungeon with you. This was a cool alternative and something that I know other games do as well, but I liked it because it gave me a chance to be a wuss and learn the dungeon before queuing as a tank with actual human players. But honestly, tanking wasn't that hard at low levels. You generate threat, or enmity, fairly easily, so as long as you hit the enemy once or twice every so often, you never really have to scramble to maintain control. And except for the 3-button combat, the experience of the dungeon was awesome. And it was a great way to introduce a new player to boss mechanics and how to navigate a dungeon that prepares them for more difficult battles. The last thing I'll talk about in this video is the profession system. Final Fantasy XIV's profession system allows you to really take on the role of being a blacksmith or a leatherworker or a goldsmith. The profession is really another class, and it requires leveling and learning new skills to be better and better at it. Basically, you join a profession guild and are given the tools to start your journey in whatever craft you choose. In order to create something in your profession, you actually have to use an interactive UI, where you use skills to produce the item and give it a level of quality. At level 1, I only had one skill, which was to add points to the creation of my item. But at level 5, I learned the skill to be able to add quality to it, which means that now if I had enough action points, I can not only create the item, but I can add a bit of quality to it. As you gain more levels, you get better skills and more action points to spend on creating items. There's profession-based gear that you can help find create better items, and they fit in your gear chest and can be assigned to a gear set specifically for your profession. The profession system is extremely fleshed out. Honestly, it's like leveling a whole new class. The only problem I had with this was that it's definitely a time sink. For better or for worse, you can spend a whole lot of time with professions. I like that you can do it and that it's a whole game on its own, but as a new player I was kind of overwhelmed a bit. I had to make the decision to consciously go back and level my professions, and so I ended up just putting it off and probably won't pick it up again until I come back and spend more time with just the profession. But overall, I like that it's a separate thing to do. It's meaningful progression, and it makes you feel like you're actually becoming a master at whatever profession it is that you're leveling it. And of course, this amount of mastery over your craft really lends itself well to roleplaying, as I'm sure it takes a long time to level up a profession to max and create quality items for top tier players, which means top tier crafters may be well respected around the server. Final Fantasy XIV is probably as close to a perfect MMORPG as we're going to get in the market today, on paper. I say on paper because obviously that statement is extremely subjective, and just because a game does a lot of things right doesn't mean that it's a good game for everyone. In fact, I originally had a hard time sticking with this game. I've actually tried Final Fantasy XIV before. My original character is a Lancer, now a Dragoon at level 52. I've been on and off subscribed for about a year now. It wasn't until I started my new character and opened up my mind to the game that Final Fantasy XIV started to click with me. Playing this game for the review had me pay attention to the different features, the mechanics, the story. I understood who the characters were and wasn't as bored by the thousands of speech bubbles between them. Most importantly, I enjoyed the combat a bit more because I was used to the long GCD, and I was playing at a slower pace overall. The review had me slow down, appreciate what the game had to offer, and not speed through all the leveling content like I do in other games. I know I'm not even close to finishing the leveling process, not to mention all the other content in the game. But with all the time I've spent on my Dragoon, I actually enjoy playing my Gladiator more. And it's not just because the Lancer is one of the most boring classes to play at lower levels. It's because while playing my new character, I actually played Final Fantasy XIV in a way that I could appreciate. So here's my main critique for Final Fantasy XIV. The beginning of the game is slow. I think we can all agree that hundreds of talk to this guy quests when the story is still in its beginning stages is definitely not going to capture everyone's attention. The beginning combat is extremely slow with repetitive skills that don't get much better until you spend quite a few hours in the game. And that's basically it. Everything else is pretty great. The music, the visuals, the community, the gameplay, everything works, it just takes a long time to get into. And for now, while I continue on my Eorzean journey, I think that's the only critique I have. Final Fantasy XIV is a time sink. It rewards you tenfold for spending the time to get involved and learning to love the game, but overall it just takes a bit of investment first, which to be honest is pretty standard for modern MMOs. For now, this video has gone on pretty long, and I gotta say, I'm not even close to experiencing everything this game has to offer. Final Fantasy XIV is a huge game with so much content that it's easy for new players to feel a bit overwhelmed, so I think there's this point before someone actually tries the game where a person could look at Final Fantasy XIV and just think, that's just way too much, and not want to spend the time to try it. But if they get past that first barrier and start playing, they'll see that it's really not that daunting of a game. Final Fantasy XIV actually handholds you in a lot of ways. In fact, there are so many optional tutorials that you could go through the whole game without realizing that there's a tutorial quest to unlock dyeing your gear. Yes, there is more content in this game than you may ever see, but it doesn't punish you in any way for not taking part in something. If you just want to level and experience a story, you can. You don't have to buy a house, you don't have to roleplay with potatoes, you don't have to gamble. You can do whatever you like and the game will feel just as good to play. For new players, I think Final Fantasy XIV's strength comes from its uniqueness. The game has common MMORPG themes, and the feel of the game early on will definitely remind players of older MMOs like classic World of Warcraft. The features are very similar, but it's all the added content and the Final Fantasy XIV flair that makes the game feel new and fresh and easy to get lost in. Final Fantasy XIV didn't just make a story quest and force you to play through it. They made multiple stories and created a world with quests in it. Final Fantasy XIV didn't just create classes, they created jobs, which function like classes, but give you the flexibility to be max level in every job on one character. Final Fantasy XIV didn't just create professions, they created an interactive crafting system that allows for deep progression and personal skill to be involved in whatever it is you are creating. Like I said, this is a game that rewards players for taking the time to enjoy their adventure and not run through everything to get to the end. The game seems to get better as you go on, but that doesn't mean the journey to get there is bad at all. And most importantly, everyone can choose to take part in whatever it is that makes them happy in the game. This casual review will most likely take a couple of videos to complete. I want to get further in the story and get to a point where I can talk about raids and trials and the PvP experience. I'd like to see how combat fares once you get a bit more complex with your skills. I'd like to join a free company and see if I can start farming mounts. I'd like to try my hand at gambling. So if you'd like to come on this journey with me, let me know in the comments below. But most importantly, I hope you enjoyed the video. Leave a like if you liked it and subscribe for more content. I hope you enjoy your Eorzean adventures, and I can't wait to see what we talk about next.